I sat there, hands trembling, staring at the adopted daughter I once cradled, now standing with a notary ready to steal the house I built my entire life around. She forged signatures, faked affection, and betrayed every ounce of trust. But what she didn't know was that I had already set the trap. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now and don't miss the next shocking episodes from us. The morning fog in Willow Hill drifted low and silent, curling its fingers around the eaves of the old green villa like it belonged there. The kind of mist that made the world feel suspended, like nothing could move forward unless it passed through this veil first. The cobblestones were damp, the pines motionless, the hydrangeas blooming in silence. It wasn't just weather, it was memory. Miss Grace stood beneath the sloped edge of the veranda, a brass watering can hanging from her hand, her cardigan slightly damp around the sleeves. Her other hand rested on the carved wooden post, beside her fingers brushing against the flaking white paint she had refused to redo for over a decade. Some things she believed were meant to wear with time. She moved slowly, not because she was weak, but because she had no one left to hurry for. The soft stream of water kissed the soil of the rose bush beneath her, the one her mother had planted before the war. She had kept it alive through drought, storms, and seasons of solitude. Roses, like people, required persistence more than care. Inside the house, the kettle began to whistle, but she didn't turn around. Not yet. These early hours belonged to her in this home, her sanctuary, her. The villa was an old colonial relic tucked into the hills of Willow Hill, a town barely marked on most maps, but known to artists, poets, and ghosts. Green walls, white shutters, iron windows with hand-forged locks. It had once been lively. Once. Laughter and piano music had echoed through the hallway. Then years took, what years always do. Voices faded, chairs were left empty, and now all that remained was the ticking of her old mantel clock and the way morning light crept across the parlor floor. She was alone, not because she had to be, but because the few she had let in had learned how to leave. But there had been one exception, Emily, a girl with autumn eyes and calloused palms who'd shown up at Grace's doorstep 18 years ago, barely 13, carrying a bag of wet laundry and no last name. The authorities had asked questions, but Grace had answered them all with silence and a signature. She taught Emily to sketch before she taught her to trust, taught her how to boil jasmine tea and how to iron linen without creasing the edges, taught her how to live like life wasn't just something to survive. Emily had left 6 years ago. No letter, no phone call, not even a birthday card on Grace's 65th. Some people called that abandonment. Grace called it an echo. And just as she bent down to trim a yellowing petal from the begonias, it came again. Clank! The gate. Metal against metal, not the wind, not a bird, a decision. Miss Grace didn't flinch. She set the watering can down, brushed the dirt from her fingers, and turned slowly. Through the mist she saw 2 figures standing just beyond the iron gate. One of them she would have recognized even with her eyes closed. Emily. Time had changed her. Her hair was longer, neater, her coat expensive, pressed. But the way she stood tilted slightly to the left, chin raised like she was daring the world to prove her wrong, that hadn't changed at all. The man next to her, though, was a stranger. He was tall, sleek, in a tailored navy suit, eyes masked behind gold-rimmed glasses. One hand casually rested on a leather carry-on bag, the other holding a box of expensive tea like it was a peace offering. His face was one of quiet calculation. Emily stepped forward first. Her voice cracked softly against the air. "Mom!" The words split the space between them like thunder. Grace said nothing. Emily's voice lifted again, this time stronger, wrapped in something practiced. "It's me. I'm back. I've missed this house so much. Missed you." She didn't wait for permission. She pushed the gate open gently but deliberately and crossed the threshold. Her arms wrapped around Grace in a sudden, eager embrace. Grace didn't return it. Not right away. Her arms stayed limp, her eyes fixed on the man still standing at the gate, his smile polite but not warm. "I'm Victor," he said, stepping forward. "Emily's husband. It's a real honor to finally meet you, Miss Grace." She nodded once. "You've been married long, almost 8 months." "Congratulations," Grace replied, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. Emily pulled back from the embrace, her hand still resting lightly on Grace's arms. "We came to Willow Hill for some rest. The city was too loud, and I couldn't stop thinking about this place, about you." Miss Grace studied her carefully. Emily had always been able to say the right things, even as a child, especially when she needed something. Still, she stepped aside. "Come in before the tea gets cold." The three of them walked slowly up the mossy pathway toward the front porch. Victor trailed his fingers along the wooden railing, eyes scanning the structure like an appraiser, not a guest. Grace noticed. She always noticed. Inside, nothing had changed. The hallway still smelled of cedar and dried lavender. The wallpaper had begun to peel near the ceiling, but the portraits on the wall remained photos of Grace as a young teacher, landscapes from her early painting days, and one rare shot of Emily at 16, sitting on the front steps, barefoot and smiling. Emily's eyes landed on it. She paused. "You kept that?" "I keep what belongs," Grace replied simply. They moved into the sitting room where the fire had long gone cold, but the armchairs still held the shape of a life lived. Victor sat only after scanning the room once, twice. Emily, however, moved like she remembered where everything was. She ran her fingers across the embroidered pillow on the chaise, picked up the old glass paperweight on the coffee table. "It's just like I remembered," she said softly. "No," Grace replied. "It's just like you left it." Emily's smile faded for a moment, then returned brighter this time, like she was trying to win something back. "I've changed," she said. "I've learned things. Life out there. It's different. I made mistakes. I'll admit it. But I came back because I realized what matters." "What matters?" Grace echoed, walking to the tea tray. "This place. You. Family. I want to make amends." Grace began pouring the tea. Her hands didn't tremble. Victor leaned forward, slightly interjecting. "We've been thinking about a new chapter. Emily said it would be healing to spend time here, maybe help you out a bit, take care of the house." His voice trailed off like a fishing line cast too far. Grace placed a teacup in front of him, then one in front of Emily, then sat down with her own. She didn't respond to his suggestion, not directly. Instead, she looked at Emily. "You vanished, without goodbye, without explanation, for 6 years. I know I was lost, but I found my way back. And you brought a stranger with you." Emily's eyes tightened just a little. "Victor's not a stranger. He's my husband. He loves me. He supports me." Grace sipped her tea, then looked at Victor. "Do you support her, Mr. Victor? Even when she runs from the things she promised to protect?" Victor hesitated. It was quick, less than a second, but Grace caught it. "I believe in second chances," he said. Grace nodded once. "So do I." The air grew thick with the smell of oolong and tension. Emily reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small velvet box. "I brought this for you," she said, handing it across the table. "A little something from Saigon. I thought it might look nice on your dresser." Grace took it, opened the lid, and saw the delicate jade brooch nestled inside. Beautiful, probably expensive, but cold. "Thank you," she said, closing the box. "But I don't wear brooches." Emily blinked. "You used to." "I used to do many things." Victor stood. "Would it be all right if I took a look around the house just to stretch my legs?" Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything worth seeing is in this room." Emily laughed a bit too loudly. "Victor's always curious about old architecture. He's not prying." "Curiosity has many faces," Grace replied, standing slowly. She gathered the teacups, her back to them, as she spoke. "You can stay the night. Your old room's been kept just as you left it." Emily stood as well. "Thank you, Mom, really." Grace turned. "We'll talk more tomorrow." As they walked up the stairs, their footsteps echoed, one light, one heavy. Miss Grace stood alone in the hallway. She didn't smile, she didn't sigh. She walked to the parlor window, parted the lace curtain, and looked out at the mist rolling in again. Beneath her breath, she whispered, "You're back, Emily, but not alone, and not as you were." Her fingers tightened slightly against the windowsill. The storm hadn't even begun, but she was already listening for thunder. The rain lingered for days after Emily and Victor arrived, misting the windows with a silver film that blurred the line between outside and in. Willow Hill was like that, soft around the edges, quiet in its judgments. But inside the house, everything had begun to move. Victor made a show of politeness each morning. He brewed coffee in the French press he'd brought himself, claimed the local roast was too acidic. He wore wool sweaters and leather loafers, the kind that didn't quite suit the stone floors of an old house. Emily, on the other hand, glided back into routine like someone reclaiming old territory. She offered to do laundry, suggested baking old recipes from memory, even arranged the tea towels in the kitchen just the way they used to be. Miss Grace watched it all in silence. There was no need to speak much. The house itself was listening. Each day followed a rhythm one Grace knew well from her years of solitude, now interrupted by too much movement in corners that had once been still. Victor often wandered off mid-morning, claiming to stretch his legs, but always returning with his phone full of photographs. Not of the hills, not of the market, but of the house. He photographed doorknobs, staircases, load-bearing columns, beams in the attic. Once he even asked casually about the foundation. Emily had laughed it off, said he was just obsessed with architecture. He watches those renovation shows, she said. Thinks he's the next design guru. But Grace didn't laugh. She simply nodded. At night, long after the two had retired upstairs, Ms. Grace would sit in the library, cup of ginseng tea, steaming quietly beside her, and turn on the monitor. A black and white interface lit up the screen, grainy, but enough to see. She had installed the cameras herself 2 years ago, after a local break-in left her uneasy. They weren't fancy, no audio, limited angles, but they recorded just fine. And what they captured wasn't silence. On the third night, she watched Victor step into the library. He didn't notice the tiny black pinhole tucked into the edge of the bookshelf, nestled behind an old Shakespeare hardback. He moved confidently, like he owned the wood under his shoes. In his hand was a phone pressed tight to his ear, and though the footage carried no sound, his body language spoke in volumes. He pointed toward the large bay window, gestured to the corners of the room, nodded thoughtfully. Then he paused. Grace leaned in toward the screen. Victor pulled a notebook from his coat pocket, flipped a few pages, and began pointing as if presenting something. He turned to face the fireplace, tapped the stone, and mouthed something Grace could just make out: load-bearing wall. Then he walked to the French doors and with a sweep of his arm said it again: great frontage. She rewound the clip 3 times that night. Frontage. She hadn't heard that word spoken in her home since the city tried to buy the land a decade ago. Back then she'd said no, and she'd meant it. The city had let it go. But something else was happening now. The next morning, Emily brought her breakfast in bed, sliced fruit, scrambled eggs, and a sprig of rosemary on the plate. "Just like I used to make," she said cheerily. Ms. Grace accepted it without question, though the scent of rosemary turned her stomach. She waited until Emily left, then quietly walked to the study and pulled up the footage again. Victor was back in the library at dawn, pacing phone in hand, then taking a quick series of photos before slipping out the back door. It was too much to be nothing. She began to pay attention to things she used to overlook: how Emily always changed the subject when the house's future came up, how Victor's smiles lasted half a second too long, how they shared glances that held something just behind the eyes. Still she said nothing, because silence had always been her most reliable weapon. Until that Thursday morning. It began like most. The fog thick, the kettle hissing, the silence crisp as folded linen. But this time, as Ms. Grace passed the parlor on her way to retrieve her knitting, she caught the tail end of a conversation. Emily's voice, low but sharp, filtered from the kitchen phone. "I told you she doesn't suspect a thing." "Yes, I'm serious. The paperwork's almost ready. I just need the original title for them to process the transfer." Grace froze in the hallway. She didn't move, didn't even breathe. The next few seconds were quiet, except for the sound of the faucet running. Then Emily spoke again, lower this time, but clearer. "No, she hasn't updated anything. It's still in her name alone. We just need to get that signature, yes, the fake one if necessary." Grace stepped back, slow and silent, as the mist outside, and returned to her bedroom. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall for a long time. They were planning something, not just whispers in the library or glances over breakfast. This was strategy. This was theft wrapped in affection. She didn't cry. She didn't storm into the kitchen. She just stood, walked to the antique dresser where she kept her documents and opened the bottom drawer. Everything was still there, or so it seemed. Her hand paused over the red silk envelope that held the property title, the one she'd kept hidden beneath old journals, and an unused quilt. But something was off. The edge of the envelope had been refolded, not in the way she did it. Hers were always crisp, methodical. This one was slightly rounded bent, as though recently opened. She pulled it out, opened the flap, and saw nothing. The title deed was gone. Her heart thumped once, heavy, then again slower. She didn't panic. Instead, she walked to the sewing room. In the back of the armoire, behind bolts of fabric and a rusted music box, she kept a small cedar box. It held backups of everything photocopies, not the originals, but enough to prove what had been missing. She opened it. The copy of the deed was still there. It was dated, signed, registered under her full name, Grace Elwood. Sole proprietor. No liens, no shared ownership. Just her. And now someone else had the original. She returned to the library and sat in her usual chair. Outside, birds chirped like nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted. She looked across the room at the fireplace, the bookshelves, the oil painting of the sea. This was more than wood and brick. It was her history, her refuge, her one true inheritance earned through years of sacrificed solitude and quiet strength. She remembered the first time Emily had touched a paintbrush, her hands trembling with fear and hunger, how she'd painted a crooked yellow sun and called it home, how she'd begged Grace to never let anyone take it away. And now Emily was doing just that. But Grace wasn't the woman she had been 6 years ago, and she certainly wasn't the kind of woman who let her home slip away beneath the fog. That night she watched the security footage again. This time she saved it. Then she opened a small notebook, wrote a single word at the top of the page, motive. Beneath it she listed 2 names, Emily, Victor. The next morning she would call her attorney. But tonight she boiled another cup of tea and sat in the dark, the glow of the screen painting her face in monochrome. Let them think they were winning. Let them get comfortable. Ms. Grace had lived her entire life preparing for storms, and this time she wasn't planning to seek shelter. She was planning to rebuild the wind. It was nearly midnight when Ms. Grace made the call. She sat in the kitchen elbows, resting on the scarred oak table, rotary phone in one hand, her other tracing idle circles across the rim of her teacup. The steam from the kettle still lingered in the air, fragrant with dried lemongrass and unease. The line rang once, then twice. Then a gravelly voice picked up on the other end. "You calling because of the house, Grace?" She smiled faintly, even though her lips didn't part. "Of course he'd know." "Hank," she said, "I need eyes." "On who?" "My daughter and her husband." A pause, the kind of silence people reserve for moments they hope will pass if ignored. "Emily," Hank Hargrove asked. "The one you used to brag about when she got accepted into that art scholarship in Saigon." Grace didn't answer. The silence was enough. He sighed. "All right, you want full surveillance." "Just him," she said, "the husband, Victor." Another pause. "What am I looking for?" She took a long breath. "Proof that my instincts aren't the only thing broken around here." He didn't ask for more. Hank was an old friend, older even than the villa. They had taught together in another life in a different time when Grace had more patience for curriculum meetings and he had more hair. After retirement, Hank had traded lesson plans for lockpicks and began working as a private investigator for people who no longer trusted the courts to settle their fears. They hadn't spoken in nearly 7 years, but tonight he didn't question why she'd reached out. "I'll start tomorrow," he said. "Text me a photo of him. Anything else?" "Yes," Grace said. "Don't get caught." The next 48 hours passed like fog rolling over a lake, quiet, slow, deceptively still. Emily continued to play the role of penitent daughter with remarkable ease. She folded laundry with reverence, took over tea-making duty with well-timed nostalgia, and even dug out old photo albums and asked if they could relive the past together. Grace played along, she smiled, she reminisced, but beneath her shawl her heart was no longer fragile. It was sharpening itself against the blade of betrayal. Victor kept his distance, but his shadow lingered in every room he left. She found faint shoe prints near her studio door, prints that didn't match her own. The books on estate law in her study had been shifted slightly on the shelf. One morning she found the drawer to her writing desk left half an inch ajar. Grace began locking everything quietly. Her journals, her financial statements, her silence. And every night she waited for Hank's call, like someone waiting for news of a ship that might never return. It was the fourth night when he finally spoke the words she already feared. They met with an attorney, Hank said. Yesterday afternoon. Corner of Whitfield and Oak. Real discreet place. They went in together, came out separately. Did you get a name? She asked. Robert L. Creighton. Private legal counsel. Mostly handles property restructuring, estate law, asset protection. Nothing shady on paper, but Victor doesn't do anything on paper unless he's already working on the final draft Grace finished. Exactly. There was a pause, and then Hank's voice lowered. When I followed Victor out, he made a call. I couldn't hear the whole thing, but I got snippets. He said, quote, "We'll use the standard POA. If she hesitates, we'll go the backdoor route." Grace's fingers clenched around the phone. POA, she repeated. Power of attorney, Hank confirmed, and from what I saw, they're planning to move fast. She nodded even though he couldn't see her. Do you want me to keep tailing him? No, she said. You've done enough. Thank you, Hank. You okay, Grace? I'm not broken, she said, just awake. She hung up, then stood, and for the first time in 6 years, she walked upstairs to the master bedroom closet, not the cedar one with her scarves and summer coats, but the hidden panel behind it where she kept what mattered. She pulled back the tapestry that hung like art but guarded like armor. Behind it, a square panel of oak slightly lighter than the rest. She slid it aside with practiced ease. A small wall safe blinked back at her, mechanical and patient. 3 turns right, 2 left, 1 more right. It clicked open. Inside was a red folder, thick cloth bound, wrapped in a navy ribbon. Her will. Her original deed. Tax records, trust declarations, letters to her niece, copies of keys, everything she had ever feared someone else might one day take. She carried the folder to her study and laid it out on the desk like an autopsy. The deed still had her name alone, no cosigner, no liens. But if someone got their hands on this, if they forged a version of it, she lifted her pen and began to annotate every document one by one in small, tight handwriting. She wrote timestamps, locations, any irregularity she noticed. In her will, she added a note in the margin update clause regarding unauthorized representatives contact Margaret. She wrote it twice. Then she folded the documents back into the folder and replaced it in the safe. Only this time she added a new layer, a small, discreet tracker embedded in the lining of the folder cover. She had bought it 2 years ago when neighborhood burglaries spiked. Had never used it. Now it felt prophetic. By the time she finished, it was after 2 in the morning. The house creaked as it always did at that hour, settling into itself like a body into old bones. But tonight Grace wasn't settling. She was fortifying. She walked through each room slowly, hands brushing over furniture, over banisters, over memories. And then, without turning on a single light, she stepped into the library. The fire had long since gone out, but the faint outline of the fireplace remained, casting a whisper of shadow across the rug. She moved to the corner shelf, reached behind a stack of dictionaries, and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside, a voice-activated recorder the size of her thumb. She pressed the button and watched the red light blink to life. She placed one behind the stack of records near the fireplace, another beneath the seat cushion of the armchair where Victor liked to sip his brandy, then one more behind the bookshelf disguised as a USB charging plug. She moved to the parlor next, placed another device under the piano bench, then slipped a second one into the false bottom of the tea drawer in the kitchen. By the time the clock struck 3, she had planted 6 devices, each one waiting, each one silent, until it didn't have to be. She returned to her room, washed her hands, and placed her nightgown over her shoulders like armor. She didn't feel tired, just sharpened. Before turning in, she wrote in her journal, March 14th, placed recorders. Hank confirmed legal meeting, mention of forged POA. Victor is not simply a guest. Emily. I don't know anymore. She closed the book and placed it under her pillow. And then she lay down, eyes open, watching the patterns of the old lace curtains sway in the moonlight. They thought she was waiting to die, but what she was really doing was preparing to live, on her terms, without them. The days that followed were dressed in masks. Emily moved through the house with the softness of a daughter trying to rebuild. She brought fresh lilies into the hallway, ironed Miss Grace's linens, and hummed old lullabies while making tea. Her eyes glittered with sentiment. Her tone never raised her affection, consistent and calculated. Anyone watching from the outside might have believed she had come home for love. But Grace had long since stopped watching from the outside. She was now listening from within. Each night when the lights dimmed and the house surrendered itself to sleep, Grace reviewed the recordings. Soft whispers in the hallway. A drawer opening at 2:12 a.m. The muted hum of Emily's voice saying, "She's old. She won't even know." The occasional sound of Victor's deep baritone, clipped and careful as he barked phrases like listing rights title search, and once clear as day, it'll be listed under a holding name. She won't trace it. The first time she heard that, Grace didn't blink. The second time she labeled the file, time-stamped it, and made 3 copies. But it wasn't until the 5th night, when Victor's voice rang out from the library camera, that she knew they had crossed into something irreversible. He was on the phone again, seated in the high-backed leather chair near the fireplace. The recording was crisp. "She'll be gone by end of month. The place is undervalued on the registry. If we play this right, we can flip it in under 6 weeks. Then he paused as though listening. "No, she's got no trust on file. Title's clean, just need the damn paper." Another pause. "I've scheduled the walkthrough for Friday. Realtor's discreet. Knows how to handle fragile cases." Fragile. That word settled into Grace like frostbite. She rewound the tape, let it play again slower this time, then turned off the monitor and sat in the dark. Her breathing was steady, her face unreadable. They weren't just circling anymore. They had begun the process, and she was done playing along. On Thursday morning, Grace rose early. She dressed with intention, gray wool dress, pearl brooch, polished shoes that hadn't touched pavement in years. Her hands moved with the grace of someone who had made a decision in silence and now walked toward it with fire beneath her feet. She didn't leave a note. She didn't announce her plans. She simply walked out of the house while Emily was in the shower and Victor was still asleep in the guest room with blackout curtains drawn. The streets of Willow Hill were damp and shining in the sun. A soft breeze rustled the cherry blossoms lining the avenue, and schoolchildren passed her on bicycles without knowing the weight she carried in her handbag. Inside was a flash drive, a folder, and a worn envelope tied with a green ribbon. Grace had an appointment. Her attorney, Margaret Trin, had once been her student, top of her class in both ethics and litigation, sharp as a scalpel and twice as precise. When Grace walked into her office at the back of the Willow Hill Preservation Council building, Margaret looked up and smiled. "Ms. Grace, I didn't expect you today." "I didn't expect betrayal this month either," Grace replied. "But here we are." Margaret stood concerned now. "Is this about Emily?" Grace didn't answer right away. She set the folder down on the desk. "I want to transfer the property," she said, "out of private hands, permanently." Margaret blinked. "You're talking about the historical registry." "I'm talking about ownership lockdown," Grace clarified. "Full registration as a protected architectural property under state designation. I want it off the market, off the record, out of reach." Margaret sat slowly. "That's a serious commitment. So is theft." A pause. Margaret opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. Deed, photos, architectural history reports, newspaper clippings from 1949 featuring the villa's original construction, a handwritten timeline of repairs and restorations done by Grace herself, and then at the bottom a USB drive. "What's on this?" she asked. "Proof," Grace replied. "Enough to burn bridges or build walls." Margaret inserted the drive and clicked open the file labeled Audio 01. Victor's voice filled the small room like oil leaking through cracks. "By end of month, undervalued, title's clean." Margaret's eyes narrowed. She didn't stop the recording. She let it play through, including the part where Emily's voice chimed in faintly from a separate clip. "She'll sign eventually. If not, we forge it. What's she gonna do, call the cops?" Silence followed. Then Margaret clicked pause. "I'll start the paperwork." The process was quick by design. Because of the house's age and architectural integrity, it had been eligible for historical status for years. Grace had always brushed it off, thinking it would restrict her autonomy. Now it was her weapon. Within 48 hours, the application was filed under emergency petition. The villa known in city archives as the Elwood House was officially entered into the Willow Hill Historical Preservation Database. Legal transfer of authority was routed through the council, locking the property into a protective clause that barred any sale, inheritance, or development without full community vote and state review. It was no longer a home in the eyes of buyers. It was a landmark, which meant Victor couldn't flip it. Emily couldn't inherit it. No one could quietly coerce it into becoming a dollar sign. When Margaret handed Grace the stamped confirmation, she also handed her a sealed copy of the legal transfer. "Congratulations," she said. "Your house is no longer vulnerable." Grace took the envelope, ran her hand over the seal. "Good," she said. "Now I want them to try." She returned home that evening just before sunset. The sky over Willow Hill glowed with that soft lavender hue that only came after spring rain. The hydrangeas along the porch had bloomed wider than usual, as though the house itself was exhaling. Emily met her at the door towel slung over one shoulder, flower on her hands. "Where were you?" she asked, tone light but tight. "Town," Grace replied. "Had errands." "You didn't leave a note." "I didn't think you'd be looking for one." Emily paused. "Victor's cooking tonight. Wants to try a new pasta recipe." "How kind of him. Do you want to join us?" Grace looked at her for a long moment, then slowly smiled. "Not tonight. I'm feeling full already." She moved past, her back straight heels clicking against the hardwood like a metronome counting down something inevitable. Upstairs, she tucked the envelope into her safe and slid the panel closed. She no longer needed to worry about locked drawers. Now the entire house was locked legally, permanently, and irrevocably. Let them smile. Let them serve pasta and charm and lies. The table was set, and Grace had just flipped the board. Check wasn't far behind. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was unusually clear that morning in Willow Hill. No mist, no fog, just a strange, bright emptiness that made everything feel too exposed. The kind of day where secrets stood out like blood on snow. Miss Grace had just finished her morning tea when she heard the knock. 3 sharp, confident raps on the front door. Not Emily's knock, not Victor's either. Grace didn't move right away. She let the moment breathe. Let the stillness of the house wrap itself around her spine like armor. Then she rose. She opened the door slowly. Standing on the porch was Emily, dressed in pale pink silk. Her hair styled into soft waves, a practiced smile painted across her lips, like it had been applied with a ruler. Next to her was Victor, looking crisp and impatient in his navy blazer. And beside them stood a man Grace had never seen before, early 50s, leather briefcase in one hand, a clipboard in the other. He wore a pin on his lapel, the insignia of a state-certified notary public. Emily stepped forward, voice like honey soaked in vinegar. "Mom," she said, "we thought it'd be a good time to just finalize a few things." Grace said nothing. Victor cleared his throat. "Just a few simple forms. Really standard. It'll take 10 minutes tops. We figured we'd get it done while everyone's home." Grace looked at the notary. His face was blank professional, but there was the slightest twitch in his fingers, a nervous tell. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said softly. "I'll put on the kettle." Emily blinked, caught off guard, but she recovered fast. "That'd be lovely. We brought oolong." "No need," Grace said as she turned toward the kitchen. "I have my own." They followed her in, settling into the sitting room like guests of honor instead of invaders. Emily placed the folder on the coffee table, flipping it open like a magician unveiling a trick that had already been rigged. "Here's the title transfer," she said smoothly, "and the acknowledgement of gift. And this one," she said, tapping the third document, "is just a verification that you're of sound mind and aware of the asset change." Victor added, "It's all very standard. We even left blanks for you to review and adjust if needed. Nothing binding yet." Yet. Grace poured the tea, the steam rising like slow thunder. She brought the cups out one by one. No sugar, no milk. She placed them gently in front of each person, except herself. She remained standing. Emily leaned back, fingers resting lightly on the pen that lay ready atop the folder. So she said with a breathy smile, "Shall we?" The silence in the room tightened. Grace didn't sit. Instead, she looked at the notary. "What's your name?" "Mr. Kellerman," he replied, a note of confusion in his voice. "And you've reviewed these documents?" He hesitated. "They were presented to me as verified drafts. I was told you were aware." "I'm not," Grace said. Victor shifted in his chair. "We just assumed." "No," Grace interrupted gently. "You didn't assume. You decided." Emily's fingers curled slightly. "Mom," but Grace raised a hand. And in that precise moment there was a knock at the door. Not tentative, not polite, authoritative. Grace turned slowly. "I believe that's for you." She walked across the room, heels striking the hardwood like a drumbeat of inevitability, and opened the door. Margaret Trin stood there, clipboard in hand, hair tied back in a severe bun. Behind her were two uniformed officers from the Willow Hill PD, Deputy Ramos and Officer Jules. Grace stepped aside without a word. Margaret entered first. "Emily Elwood," she said sharply, her voice slicing through the room like piano wire. "Victor Chen. This meeting has been preemptively reported as a potential act of coercive transfer and document fraud." Victor shot to his feet. "Wait, what?" Emily paled. "What is this?" Margaret didn't flinch. "By the authority granted to this office and based on evidence submitted by the legal owner of this property, we are executing a stop action on any and all transactions concerning this address." She nodded to Officer Ramos, who stepped forward and handed Victor a folded letter. "This is a cease and desist," Ramos said. "Any further attempt to process or submit forged documents digitally or physically will trigger criminal investigation and civil proceedings." Victor stumbled back a step, face losing all color. Emily stood frozen. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "Mom, what is this?" The notary Kellerman looked between them, eyes wide, lips parting in stunned disbelief. "I was told this was pre-approved," he mumbled. "You were lied to," Grace said softly. Emily finally found her voice. "You tricked us." "I protected myself," Grace replied. "There's a difference." Victor reached for the folder, but Officer Jules placed a hand over it. "This is now evidence," she said calmly. "Please step away." Emily looked at Grace, eyes wide and trembling. "You called the police on us." "No," Grace said. "I called the law. The police came with it." Victor's mouth twisted. "You have no idea what you've just ruined." Grace turned her gaze on him, calm and unblinking. "No, Mr. Chen. I have no idea what you thought you were building, but I just watched it fall." Emily stepped forward, voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to go like this. We were just trying to help you." Grace tilted her head. "Is that what you call it?" she said. "Forging signatures, scheduling walkthroughs, negotiating sale prices behind my back." Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't think you'd fight back." Grace smiled faintly. "That's always the mistake, isn't it?" Margaret closed the folder and handed it to Officer Jules. "We'll hold the documents for review. Miss Grace, I'd advise you to file the official injunction within the next 48 hours. Grace nodded. "I will." Officer Ramos turned toward Emily and Victor. "You're not under arrest, but you are formally cautioned. If any further legal steps are taken without representation, they will be considered willful misconduct." Victor didn't respond. He just stared at the floor like it had betrayed him. Emily's breath came short and fast. Her hand trembled at her side. "Mom," she said again, softer this time. "Please, we didn't mean..." But Grace had already begun to walk away, not toward her room, toward the garden. She paused only once. "You brought a notary," she said over her shoulder. "I brought a boundary." Then she disappeared through the French doors and into the soft afternoon light. Inside the sitting room, Emily collapsed into the velvet chair, head in her hands. Victor stood, fists clenched, rage curdling his features like milk in the sun. Kellerman, the notary, muttered an apology no one heard and quickly packed his things. And in the space where a signature was supposed to go, there was only white. White as bone. White as the silence Grace had sharpened into a blade. The game as they knew it was over, and they had never understood the rules. It happened faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours of the confrontation at the house, the wheels of consequence began to turn slow at first, then mercilessly fast. The following morning, Grace stood in the garden pruning her hydrangeas when a police cruiser pulled up quietly along the curb. It didn't use its siren. It didn't need to. In a town like Willow Hill, silence was far louder. Officer Jules stepped out, her uniform, pressed eyes firm but not unkind. "Miss Grace," she said gently. Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "I suppose she didn't leave." "She's still at the inn," Jules confirmed. "We have a detain order." Grace nodded. "She won't run," she said softly. "She doesn't know how." But Victor did. That same morning, before the sun had fully broken through the clouds, he vanished. The hotel manager said he checked out at 5:43 a.m. No luggage, no questions. Security footage showed him stepping into a dark sedan at the corner of Maple and 3rd, disappearing into traffic like a shadow slipping into another one. The authorities issued a bulletin, but no warrant. Not yet. Because at the center of it all was Emily. She was still in Willow Hill, still pretending in some small, crumbling part of herself that it wasn't over. She was seated on a bench just outside the local sheriff's office when the officers approached. Her hair was tied up too neatly, her dress creased from having been slept in. She didn't look up when they called her name. She didn't protest when they read the order. She didn't say a word as the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. But she flinched just once when Grace appeared at the end of the walkway, arms folded across her chest, eyes calm as stone. "You told me I was your home," Grace said, barely loud enough to be heard. Emily's lips trembled, but she said nothing. The crowd gathered slowly that afternoon. Reporters, photographers, townspeople who'd once bought art from Emily at the local gallery. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others just couldn't reconcile the story they'd read in the headlines with the girl they remembered from after-school painting classes. The Willow Hill Gazette was first to publish the story. Forgery and family. Foster daughter, accused in heritage estate scam. A subheading ran across the middle of the page. Historic Willow Hill home saved from fraudulent transfer, legal owner acts just in time. By evening, the story had made its way to state news. An elderly woman fending off betrayal. A legal ambush stopped cold by foresight and grit. The public latched onto it. The narrative was too rich a historic home, a cunning daughter, a city man in a tailored suit who'd disappeared without a trace. They called it the Elwood House scandal. Grace didn't read the full articles. She didn't need to. The phone started ringing before dinner. Reporters, old acquaintances, a professor from a nearby university asking if she'd be open to having her story included in a lecture on estate law and elder protection. She unplugged the landline by sundown. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. Not yet. That night she walked the halls of her home as if relearning it. Every room felt different now, not in structure but in tone, as if the betrayal had left fingerprints on the furniture dust in the corners she hadn't cleaned since they'd arrived. In the library, she stood beneath the chandelier and looked up at the beam where Victor had once stood and measured angles with his phone. She wondered where he was now. Hiding, probably. Recalculating. Men like him always had a second plan. But Grace wasn't interested in him either. The person who stayed was the one she needed to face. It was 3 days later when Emily finally broke. Not in court, not in front of lawyers or judges, but during a taped interview ordered by her legal counsel for the Investigation Review Board. She sat in a cold, beige-walled room, hands folded in front of her, a microphone clipped to her blouse. Her eyes were swollen not from bruises, but from nights without sleep. Her voice, when she spoke, was small, not weak, just unraveling. The investigator's voice was neutral. "Ms. Elwood, can you explain why you pursued the transfer of ownership on a property you didn't legally own?" Emily inhaled. Her lips parted. No words came. He tried again. "You were aware that Ms. Grace Elwood is the sole registered title holder." She nodded slowly. "Yes. And yet you presented documents to a notary, initiated a meeting with legal intent to transfer the deed." Another nod. "Why?" Emily looked up then, and her eyes filled. She whispered it as if it hurt. "Because I thought she wouldn't stop me." The room was quiet. The investigator didn't speak. He just waited. Emily looked down again. "I thought. If I acted like the daughter she always wanted me to be, if I smiled and made tea and dusted the shelves she kept for 40 years, she'd just sign." She swallowed. "She used to tell me this house would be mine, not legally, not in writing, but emotionally. She said it was my home. It wasn't yours to sell," the investigator said. "No," Emily agreed, "but I thought it should be." Another silence. And then came the question she hadn't expected. From behind the two-way glass, a voice fed into the earpiece of the investigator. He adjusted his papers. "Miss Elwood," he said carefully, "if I may ask something personal." She blinked. "Why?" he said. "Why would you do this to the woman who saved you? Why betray the one person who gave you a name, a roof, a future?" Emily's shoulders shook, and for the first time since her arrest, she cried. Not delicately, not performatively. It was raw, ugly, real. "I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe because I didn't believe she'd ever let go. Not of the house. Of me." The tape continued for 26 minutes. By the end, Emily had admitted everything. The forged drafts, the scheduled appraisal, the call to Victor's broker in Boston, the falsified signature practice sheets. All of it. She confessed not just to the crime, but to the grief. Grief of never fully belonging, of being loved but never fully forgiven for being someone Grace didn't bear herself. It didn't justify what she had done, but it explained it. And in cases like these, explanation was the only thing more dangerous than motive. News of her confession broke quietly. Just a few sentences in the bottom corner of the Willow Hill Sentinel. No new headlines, no camera crews. The world had moved on, but Grace had not. She watched the interview on a small screen in Margaret's office. No reaction, no flicker of emotion. When it ended, Margaret reached across the desk. "You okay?" Grace leaned back in her chair. "She cried," she said. "She finally cried." Margaret nodded. "Do you forgive her?" Grace didn't answer. Instead, she looked out the window at the clouds rolling in again over Willow Hill. "I gave her everything," she said. "Not because she earned it, but because I believed she would one day rise to deserve it." She paused. "I didn't know." She thought the house was the gift. Margaret stayed silent because she understood. The house wasn't the gift. Grace was. And now the gift had closed its doors. But not because of spite, because it had to survive. It was early morning when Miss Grace changed the locks. The dew hadn't yet lifted from the porch railing, and the breeze carried that particular stillness that only visited Willow Hill in the hour between sunrise and the first bird call. Her slippers pressed quietly against the brick pathway as she stepped outside with the old ring of keys in one hand and a new set nestled in her coat pocket. She stood in front of her door not just as its keeper, but now as its protector. The locksmith had come the night before. An old friend. No paperwork, no receipt, just a quiet nod exchanged at the threshold and the sound of new tumblers being set into place. It had taken less than 20 minutes, but the act felt like closing a wound sewn too loosely the first time. Now in the hush of dawn, she slid the old keys, those that once dangled from Emily's lanyard from Victor's coat pocket, into a cloth pouch. Then she walked to the side of the house where the hydrangeas had just begun to bloom again and buried them beneath the roots. 6 inches deep. No ceremony. No grief. Just distance. She dusted off her hands and exhaled. It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. For the first time in weeks, no, in years, her home belonged fully to silence again. The furniture didn't bristle under tension. The windows didn't strain to eavesdrop. The floorboards no longer whispered under the weight of secrets. She turned the new key in the lock, heard the smooth click, and stepped inside. The sun was barely awake. The house smelled of sandalwood and cedar, and the faint ghost of the jasmine oil she used to rub into Emily's scalp after bath time. That memory came without warning, and it didn't ask permission. She paused at the base of the stairs, one hand resting on the worn banister. A different kind of ache settled in her chest, not sharp, not hollow, just tired. The kind of tired that came not from age but from release, like a hand unclenching after being held in a fist for too long. She turned and walked toward the sitting room. There on the corner shelf sat a framed photo. It had been taken 15 years ago in the garden, summer. Emily was 11, covered in paint, her teeth too big for her face, smiling at the canvas she had just finished. Miss Grace stood behind her in a sun hat, one hand on the girl's shoulder. They were both laughing, frozen in a moment that once felt like forever. She picked up the frame, ran her fingers along the glass. She could still remember the way Emily had cried the first time she got the flu, how she'd curled up on the chaise shivering and stubborn, insisting she didn't need medicine. How Grace had stayed up all night feeding her spoonfuls of ginger porridge, singing that old lullaby her own mother used to hum a tune without words, just melody and comfort. She remembered the first drawing Emily had ever made. It was awful stick figures with too many fingers. A dog that looked like a chair, but Grace had kept it anyway, pinned to the corkboard above her desk for years. The second one was better. By the third, Emily was already correcting her perspective. She had been sharp. She had been fire and hunger and hope, and Grace had loved her with a kind of certainty that could burn bridges before realizing they were even built. She walked to the fireplace and sat on the rug cross-legged, the photo still in her lap. Around her, the room held its breath. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the hall. Somewhere in the distance, a dove cooed. She didn't cry. She didn't feel the need. What she felt instead was the slow, clean weight of a truth accepted. Emily had once needed saving, and Grace had done it, willingly, fully. But not all rescued things choose to remain grateful. Some forget the hand that lifted them. Some even bite it. She placed the photo face down on the coffee table and rose to her feet. She walked to the hallway mirror, stared at her reflection. The face that stared back was lined but composed eyes clear, but rimmed with the pale rings of fatigue. Her silver hair was still pinned in the chignon she wore for court. She reached up and pulled the pins free one by one. The hair fell around her shoulders longer than she remembered, streaked with white and steel, still soft despite the years. She turned and walked to the bathroom, opened the cabinet, pulled out the shears. She stood in front of the mirror again and took the first lock between her fingers. She didn't hesitate. Snip. The sound echoed like a whisper of thunder. Another lock, then another. Strands of silver floated to the tile like petals in reverse bloom. When she was done, her hair fell just below her jawline, clean, severe, deliberate. She didn't style it. She didn't smile. She just stared. The woman in the mirror wasn't someone's mother anymore. She was her own again. She gathered the hair into a linen pouch, tied it shut, and placed it in the old wooden box where she kept other relics, a ticket from her first art show, a brooch from her grandmother, a pressed flower from a long-forgotten suitor. Then she returned to the kitchen and brewed herself a cup of tea. Elderflower, strong, bitter, just the way she liked it. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the porcelain like they were holding something sacred. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel mournful. She felt clean. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the clouds. It spilled across the floor in soft gold, warming the rug where Emily had once spilled ink and cried because she thought she'd ruined it forever. Grace never replaced that rug. She never corrected that drawing, because some things once flawed became more honest. She closed her eyes, took a sip, and let the heat fill her. Her home was whole, and so was she. Spring arrived quietly in Willow Hill. There were no grand gestures, no parades of blossom, no explosions of color. Just a slow softening of the air, a shift in the way the sun lingered on the porch, and the sound of robins returning to the garden hedges. Inside the Elwood house, something else had returned too. Laughter. Faint at first, uncertain, cautious, but laughter nonetheless. The kind that tumbled out of small mouths, rose above dusty floorboards, and echoed off the rafters like music that had been waiting decades to be heard. It started with 3 children, then 5, then 10, and by the end of the second month there were 12 young faces gathered beneath the eaves of the house Ms. Grace had once fought so fiercely to protect. She had named it the Thien Huang Art Home Heaven Scent, she explained, for the way jasmine filled the air during spring storms and how memory clung to smell long after people forgot everything else. The name wasn't Vietnamese in structure, not exactly, but it was Vietnamese in spirit, in poetry, and in truth. Grace had reached out quietly through an old colleague at the city orphanage, through whispered questions at the community center, through an old poster tacked to the church bulletin board. No fanfare, just an open invitation. Do you have a child who doesn't fit inside a school but fits inside a song? Do they see colors others can't? Would they like to learn? The response had been slow, measured, suspicious at first, but then they came. One girl arrived barefoot with paint already under her fingernails. Another clutched a broken violin with no bow. A boy with a stutter asked if he could just sit and listen. They came in ones and twos, eyes wary, silence thick on their shoulders. Grace welcomed each of them the same way, with a cup of tea, a warm smile, and a place to sit. No tests, no forms, no fee. She turned the old greenhouse into a music room strung with mismatched instruments donated by neighbors and alumni. The library, once silent and tense, became the painting studio. Brushes were laid out like soldiers. Water jars gleamed in the morning light. The parlor she kept as it was, but added a long bench under the windows, a makeshift gallery where the children could pin their sketches and poems and finger paint masterpieces. She didn't teach in the traditional sense. She told stories. On the first morning, she sat with the children under the veranda as rain tapped rhythm against the old tiled roof. Her hair now cropped short, her eyes soft but focused. She held a watercolor pad in her lap and looked at them one by one. Art, she said, isn't just beauty. It's rebellion. It's survival. It's how we scream without raising our voices. The children were quiet, but they listened. That first week, one of them painted a picture of a tree that cried leaves made of glass. Another sculpted a tiny bird out of clay and painted its wings black. One child, 7 years old and mostly mute, drew a field of fire and handed it to Grace without saying a word. She hung it in the center of the gallery wall. They weren't just drawing, they were bleeding safely, and the house took it all in. By the end of the second month, the town took notice. It started with whispers at the grocer. "Did you hear what Miss Grace is doing? She's opened her doors to the children. The house, it's alive again." Then the mayor's assistant called. Then the local paper. Then Channel 7. When the reporter arrived, Grace nearly sent them away. She didn't like the idea of spectacle. But the children stood by the door, eyes wide, one of them already clutching a homemade script like it was a golden ticket. So she relented. They filmed on a Thursday. The sun was high, the wind gentle. The segment aired that Saturday night. The title, One Roof, Many Stories. With the subtitle, At the Tien Huang Art Home Healing, comes in colors. The footage opened with a wide shot of the villa ivy climbing the gate petals scattered across the walkway, light pouring through open windows. Then came the voiceover, soft, reverent. "In the heart of Willow Hill stands a house that once weathered betrayal and now sings with rebirth." Cut to children sketching on the veranda, one girl playing a shaky but brave version of Twinkle Twinkle on an out-of-tune cello. Cut to Grace seated in her rocking chair, telling the story of how her mother taught her to blend pigments with egg yolk during wartime when paint was too expensive. She didn't cry, but her voice caught when she said children don't ask for pain, but sometimes they inherit it. My job now is to give them something different to pass on. The clip ended with a boy, a wiry 12-year-old with nervous eyes, standing next to his finger-painted mural of a phoenix rising from a cracked house. When asked what the painting meant, he said simply, "It's about a place that didn't let the fire win." The segment ran for 6 minutes. The town didn't speak of anything else for a week. Donations flooded in books, brushes, pianos, even a handmade marimba. Letters, too, from mothers, from teachers, from adults who had once been those children. One envelope came addressed simply to Miss Grace, the lady with the house, Willow Hill, USA. Inside was a photo, a young woman holding a paintbrush, her daughter by her side. The note read, "You taught me to color outside the lines. Now I teach my daughter the same." But Grace didn't keep the letters. She didn't hang the article. She didn't accept the mayor's invitation for a community honor. She just kept teaching. Each morning she opened the doors. Each night she swept the paint water down the old stone steps and wiped every bench with lemon oil. Sometimes she sat with the children and painted alongside them, but mostly she listened to how their feet moved when they danced in the sunroom, listened to how their voices cracked when they hit high notes, listened to the pages turning in the library when one of them discovered Monet or O'Keeffe or Satie for the first time. The house had become a home again, but not for inheritance, not for possession, for expression. And in that space, Miss Grace became something else. Not just a guardian, not just a survivor. She became a bridge between what was and what could be, between silence and voice, between yesterday's betrayal and tomorrow's bloom. She didn't need to say it out loud. The children knew. Every time they stepped through the front door, they weren't just entering a house. They were stepping into a promise. That no matter how broken the world had been to them before, here under this roof with these brushes and this tea and this woman who looked at them like they were art, they would never be forgotten, never again. The letter came folded in 3 with careful creases and handwriting so neat it could have been mistaken for printed script. It arrived without return address, sealed in a simple beige envelope bearing only Miss Grace's name in tight slanted strokes, no honorific, no title, just Grace Elwood, as if the sender couldn't quite bring herself to write Mom again. The prison stamp was smudged, the ink blurred from rain or regret. Grace received it on a Thursday. It had been a quiet morning. The children were painting sunflowers on old cardboard sheets in the back garden. A radio hummed something sweet and slow through the kitchen window. The smell of cinnamon from the morning's oatmeal still lingered in the hallway. For a moment, life had that soft rhythm again, simple, repetitive, survivable. Then the mail dropped. She almost didn't see it. It was nestled between a utility bill and a flyer for a new plumbing service. But the envelope was thin, and there was something about the way her name had been written, like someone tracing the edge of memory with careful fingers that made her pause. She took it to her study, sat by the window, slid her finger beneath the flap. The paper inside was plain college rule torn from a journal. There was no greeting, only words. If this ever reaches you, it's because I had the courage to send it. I don't know if you'll read past the first sentence. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I'll write it anyway. For me, for you, for what we never understood. I'm sorry. That word is too small, I know. It's a drop of water thrown into a house fire. But I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry for betraying you, for thinking the house was more valuable than the hands that built it, for letting my fear of not belonging turn into something cold and cruel. I still remember the first time you let me hold a brush. I was 10. I spilled paint all over the tile and cried because I thought you'd send me away. But you sat on the floor next to me and dipped your fingers into the mess and said, "See, now it's a memory." I never forgot that. If I could do it over, I wouldn't change the mistakes because I know I needed to fall. But I would change the way I fell on you. You didn't deserve that. They say people only realize their mother's love when they lose it. But I knew it even as I broke it. That's the part that hurts the most. If there is another life after this one, another chance, another thread, we get to walk together. Please let me be your daughter again. I won't want the house. I'll just want the mornings, the jasmine, the way you always poured tea before scolding me like you wanted me to know love was still present even in anger. I miss you. I miss who I was when I stood beside you and believed I was enough. I'm not asking for anything, not forgiveness, not redemption. I just wanted you to know. I remember the songs you hummed when I had nightmares, and I still dream in the color of your garden. Emily. Grace sat still for a long time. The letter rested in her lap, the paper warm from the heat of her palms. Outside the window, the children's laughter floated up like birdsong, but she couldn't hear it, not fully, not yet. She didn't cry. There were no tears left for Emily. Not because she had hardened, but because something inside her had accepted. And that kind of peace didn't make room for sobbing. Instead, she stood, crossed the room, opened the drawer of her cedar chest. Inside lay a smaller box carved from rosewood lined with velvet. It had once belonged to her mother. For years, Grace had kept it sealed, a sanctuary of keepsakes no one else had touched. She lifted the lid. Inside were a few artifacts of a former chapter, a broken string from Emily's first violin, a photograph of them painting sunflowers on the porch, and one sketch faded and wrinkled at the corners of Emily at age 12, drawn by Grace herself, her hair wild, her smile too wide. The words, "my daughter," my storm penciled faintly beneath the chin. Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath the drawing. Then she closed the box and locked it, not as an act of dismissal, but of preservation. Some things didn't need to be revisited to be remembered. That night the air turned cooler. A wind moved through Willow Hill, rustling the eucalyptus leaves outside the gates of the Elwood house. The children were already asleep, their bedrooms dark, except for one, the boy who never liked silence and always kept a tiny radio playing Beethoven softly near his pillow. Grace stood in the parlor, a cup of tea in her hand, the light from the reading lamp casting a golden circle across the floor. Then she felt it. Not heard, felt. A shift, a presence. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain back, and saw him, Victor. He stood outside the gate, arms folded, face obscured beneath the brim of a charcoal gray hat. He wasn't moving, just standing, like a statue, like a man frozen in the space between nerve and regret. Grace didn't open the door, didn't unlock the gate. She didn't need to. Victor wasn't there to break in. He was there to reckon. They locked eyes through the glass, and for a second, just a second, she saw the flicker of something in him. Not remorse, not even sadness, just emptiness. The look of a man who had won in all the wrong rooms and lost in the one place he didn't understand until too late. He didn't wave, didn't call out. After a few minutes he turned and walked away. Not quickly, not dramatically, just away. Grace watched until he disappeared down the road, swallowed by the curve of the hill and the shadow of the old trees that lined the lane. Then she stepped back, let the curtain fall. She turned off the light and went to bed, not because the world had offered closure, but because she no longer needed it to. It was the first day of the new term at the Tianhuang Art Home. The front porch of the old villa buzzed with soft voices. laughter, and the rustle of sketchbooks being flipped open. Children both familiar and new gathered beneath the arch of blooming bougainvillea. Sunlight filtered gently through the vines, throwing soft shadows across the floorboards. The air smelled of fresh paint and warm earth. At the center of it all stood Miss Grace. She looked at them, the children she had grown to love as her own, each one with a different story, a different pain, a different fire. Her short silver hair gleamed under the morning sun, and her voice when it came carried years of quiet power. This porch, she said, was once just a place to keep out the rain, a roof to hide under. She paused, eyes traveling across the eager faces. But I've come to believe that a porch is much more than shelter. It's where kindness has space to grow, where pain has permission to rest, and where new stories are born. The kids listened not just with their ears, but with their bodies, still wide-eyed, leaning forward, as if the words themselves were warmth. This place belongs to all of you now, Grace continued. Not just the rooms or the paints or the music, but the idea that you are safe here, that you matter here, that your voice belongs. Her eyes softened. Let this be the term where you find your voice, and let it be loud even when it's quiet. The children clapped. It started slowly, then spread like sunlight, spontaneous, full of life. One of the older girls' knees stood up and handed Grace a rolled-up poster tied with string. "We made this," she said proudly, "for the welcome wall." Grace untied it carefully, hands trembling just a little. It was a mural, bright, beautiful chaos. Children had painted crooked houses, giant suns, trees with hands for branches, stars falling into rivers. But at the center of the mural was a house that looked unmistakably familiar. Green walls, white shutters, a porch wrapped in pink bougainvillea. And sitting under the porch roof, drawn with soft colors and a smiling face, was Miss Grace herself, holding a cup of tea, a sleeping cat curled up beside her. Above her, in bold letters written in a mix of red, yellow, and blue, were two simple words, Mama Grace. She froze. It had been years since anyone called her that. It was what Emily used to say as a child, when the boundaries between blood and love hadn't yet been tested. A mix of Vietnamese and endearment. It meant Mother Grace. And seeing it now written by children who had no idea of its history was like a soft breeze brushing over an old scar. Grace blinked hard, then smiled. "It's beautiful," she whispered. The children grinned. One of them tugged on her sleeve. "We made you the heart of the house." She didn't reply right away. Instead, she rolled the mural gently and said, "Let's hang it together." Later that afternoon, after the music room had quieted, the paint jars rinsed and brushes set to dry, Grace stepped back out onto the porch. She carried a fresh cup of jasmine tea and sat down in her favorite wicker chair. The bougainvillea above her swayed softly in the breeze, petals drifting down like confetti from a celebration she hadn't planned but deeply needed. From where she sat, she could see the children out in the yard, their laughter floating like music across the stones. One of them ran with a kite shaped like a phoenix, the tail streaming behind her in brilliant reds and golds. Another was drawing quietly under the persimmon tree, sketching the house with a kind of careful reverence. Grace leaned back. She took a sip of tea. The sunlight spilled across her lap and the wind whispered through the vines. She wasn't thinking of betrayal, not of trials, not of broken trust, not even of the woman who once called her mother only to try and take everything. She was thinking of color, of growth, of how something could be destroyed and still bloom again. The house, her house, was no longer just a place of memory. It was a place of movement, of future, of healing made visible. And she was still here, still standing, still giving, not because she needed to prove anything, but because there was still so much more to give. As she sat beneath the roof she'd once thought would collapse under grief, she realized something simple and profound. Love doesn't end when someone leaves. It ends when you stop giving it. And Grace Elwood had never stopped. She watched the sunlight shift again through the vines and smiled, not because it was over, but because finally peace had come home to stay. The screen slowly shifts to a warm amber tone. The sound of a soft piano melody mingles with the gentle chirping of birds. Outside the veranda of the now transformed Willow Hill estate, no longer a private villa, but now lovingly known as the Heavenly Fragrance Art Home Life, moves with an air of quiet purpose. Children scatter across the cobblestone path, their giggles blending with the morning breeze. Some are crouched over sketchbooks, painting vibrant sunflowers and houses with red roofs. Others sway to the rhythm of a small string quartet formed by their peers, their small hands clumsily but earnestly strumming chords and holding notes. And at the center of it all, sitting calmly on her woven rattan chair under a trellis of blooming bougainvillea, is Madame Grace. Her silver hair is now trimmed short, framing a face weathered not just by time but by trials. Her eyes, though aged, shimmer with life. She watches the children like a gardener watches over a field of wildflowers, each child imperfect but vibrant, chaotic but alive. Inside, the foyer has been turned into a gallery, walls lined with crayon art handprints on canvases, collages made from fallen leaves. Above the fireplace hangs a framed drawing labeled in uneven handwriting, "Dream Home." In it the children have drawn the house a garden, and standing in the middle, Madame Grace, arms outstretched with a heart over her chest and a banner that reads, "Mom Grace." The camera shifts to the grand room, now a classroom. Little feet tap in rhythm, a girl hums a lullaby, and in a soft, gravelly voice, Madame Grace tells them stories not from books, but from life. About a woman who once feared losing everything and instead found something more lasting meaning. Then the children ask, "Why did you name this place Heavenly Fragrance?" She smiles, "Because it reminds me of something my mother used to say. Real love leaves a scent long after the person is gone. It lives in music and laughter, in the paint beneath your nails." Applause follows, not the loud, thundering kind, but the sincere clapping of small hands full of hope. Later that day, a local television station sets up on the lawn. The host speaks gently into the camera. "Today, in the heart of Willow Hill, we discovered something extraordinary. A home that was nearly lost is now a haven for those who never had one. A former art teacher turned a betrayal into a legacy. One rooftop. Many lives changed. This is not just a house, it's a heartbeat." The segment closes with footage of children releasing painted paper birds into the air, the sky lit with laughter. Finally, the screen begins to fade as the piano grows softer. Madame Grace returns to her chair. She leans back slightly. Eyes closed, face turned toward the sunlight that filters through the vines. The breeze catches the edge of her shawl. The laughter still lingers in the air. Then words appear slowly across the black screen. The keeper of a house does not only guard its bricks, but the memories and hopes of those who pass through its doors. And a mother, even if not by blood, can still be the light that leads us home.